Okay, so we're going to talk about the two nurses' songs in the Songs of Innocence and Experience. And let's kick off with the Innocence song. Here it is. When the voices of children are heard on the green and laughing is heard on the hill. Like a lot of Blake's poems, it has the feel of a nursery rhyme or a child's song. But as we know, very often if we dig below the surface level, we can find deeper meanings, more profound things going on. So let's have a look at the surface level and then let's consider the deeper things that are going on here. It sounds like a nursery rhyme from the opening line. When the voices of children, that dactylic rhythm, two unstressed and then one stressed beat, da-da-dum, da-da-dum, when the voices of children are heard on the green. Very typical of a nursery rhyme. It has a very light, skipping sort of rhythm. It sounds very cheery, very cheerful. The other things that are very childlike about it, the very simple lexis, the words are very straightforward, quite a lot of monosyllabic terms here. The regular rhymes, hill, still, arise, skies, sleep, sheep, and so on, as well as the actual situation, all give it a very childlike, familiar nursery rhyme quality. Note also, Blake is so fascinated by sounds, isn't he? Many of the poems are full of the sounds of voices, the sounds of people. Here we have voices laughing, the hills echoing at the end. We also have the reference to green here. The voices of children are heard on the green. Blake doesn't go into great detail when he describes nature, unlike some of the other romantic poets of the period like Wordsworth, Coleridge, and later poets like Byron and Keats. He gives us just enough so we know where we are. He locates it within nature, on the green. This is obviously in the voice of the nurse. Again, as in a lot of romantic poetry, he uses a persona. So here we have the voice of the nurse, and we'll discuss a little bit later on what she might represent. But in this third line, my heart is at rest within my breast, the internal rhyme there sets up a sort of rocking rhythm, rest, breast, very soothing, very reassuring, perhaps appropriately so for a poem which is about the relationship between a nurse and her children. A nurse, remember, what he means by nurse is more what we would call a nanny, or somebody whose job it is to look after children, to care for children. Again, as in a lot of Blake, the poem is set in the form of a dialogue, or dialogue is very important to the poem. So in this second stanza, she's actually talking to the children. Then come home, my children, the sun is gone down, and the dews of night arise. Very obviously, she's feeling protective towards the children. She wants to look after them. And the night obviously symbolizes danger, symbolizes things she wants to protect them from. And if we move on to the third stanza, we then are given the voice, or the voices of the children themselves. No, no, let us play, for it is yet day, and we cannot go to sleep. The repetition of no at the beginning there is quite emphatic, isn't it? No, no, let us play. They feel very strongly about this. And there is a logic to their argument, and that logic is one based on an identification with nature. They see themselves as part of nature. If the little birds can still be out, why can't they? If the sheep are still out and about, why can't they be out? They see themselves as at one with nature. And when we turn to the fourth stanza, it's very clear that the nurse has listened to them and the nurse has heard them. And she compromises, she negotiates. It's almost as if she has struck a deal with them. Well, well, go and play till the light fades away, and then go home to bed. I mean, she's still in control. That line, and then go home to bed. She's still setting the boundaries, she's setting the rules, but she's prepared to negotiate, she's prepared to compromise with them. And the last two lines are just an expression of joy. The little ones leaped and shouted and laughed. We have that wonderful triad of verbs, this run of three verbs, very active, very dynamic, very joyful sounding verbs, with a little bit of alliteration there. Leaped and laughed, leaped and shouted and laughed. The repetition of and, again, very childlike. Children often connect things with and Blake has mimicked their voices here. And all the hills echoed. Echoed is probably how Blake would have said it, to rhyme rather with bed. And it's a lovely image, as if, again, reinforcing the idea of the children and nature being at one together. The children are making a noise, and the hills are making a noise. It's like they're joining together in a song of joy. And that perhaps takes us on to Rousseau, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who, of course, was the Swiss philosopher born in Geneva but lived most of his life in France, except for a brief excursion that he had in England. And of course he was very devoted to the idea of educating children in nature, quite a revolutionary idea for the 18th century. And he wrote a very famous novel, in fact, which explores these ideas or illustrates these ideas. It's called Émile. And it portrays an image of a child being brought up and in nature and being educated by the natural world. And many of the romantics of the late 18th century were highly influenced by this. Wordsworth, Coleridge, Wordsworth famously says, "The child is father to the man." In other words, the way you bring up your children will produce the sort of adults that you get. And Wordsworth also talked about how you can learn more from a walk in the woods or a walk in nature than you can from a whole library of books. Whether we agree with that or not, on a practical level, it's a very beautiful expression of the moral and educative power that they thought nature had. Well, we have to remember also that this was a period of great repression in Britain. Following the French Revolution, a lot of people in this country were very excited by the French Revolution and wanted the same thing to happen here. And these people were given the name of radicals. And Blake himself identified with the radicals. He would often walk the streets of London, we're told, wearing the red cockade hat of the French revolutionaries. And perhaps we can see in this poem a sort of coded reference to government and the relationship between government and the people. If the nurse is a figure of authority, does she represent the authority of the government, which in this case listens to the people, works with the people, negotiates with the people, finds solutions with the people? Okay, and perhaps it's been given to us as an image that Blake hopes that his government would work towards. It's coded perhaps because people were being put in prison at this stage for being openly critical of the government, and there were quite strict laws to do with sedition and treason. So presenting it to us in a coded way is perhaps a clever way around that. Let's move on to the Experience poem. And it begins in exactly the same way, when the voices of children are heard on the green. And we think we're going to get the same poem, but of course we get a very different poem. And this illustrates, of course, Blake's intentions in the songs of presenting to us the two contrary states of the human soul. as structuralists would argue, much of literature, much of our understanding of the world is founded on binary opposites, or the duality of opposites, the tension of opposites. And we have them very clearly here. The next line, whisperings in the dale, whisperings are in the dale. Well, in the first poem we had laughing, here we have whispering. In the first poem we had a hill, here we have a dale. And so the first poem's images of openness, the open space of the hill, here become an enclosed space. The enclosed, a dale is like a small little valley, where laughing is sort of like an open sort of sound that everybody can hear. Whispering suggests secrecy, something that's covert, something almost conspiratorial. And the nurse then goes on to, it's almost as if it provokes a memory of her own childhood. Remember, the experience poems are often seen from the adult perspective, whereas the other poems, the innocence poems, are seen from the child's perspective. And it's as if she has a very negative, it's almost sickly view of her own childhood. She seems to be jealous of the children. The word green turns up again, but here it takes on a new meaning. Green suggesting sickness, suggesting jealousy. The second stanza begins with the same request, "Come home, my children, the sun is gone down." But it ends with this very bleak, very nihilistic view of human experience. Nihilism, Nihilism, is a view of life that is dominated by nothingness, no optimism, no expectations, a very negative way of looking at things. If following through the nature imagery, the spring perhaps represents childhood, she sees this period of life as being wasted, a complete waste of time, completely opposite to Rousseau's view of childhood being, that the play of childhood, the closest to nature, being the period in which the adult is formed. She sees adulthood here, if adulthood is represented by winter, this later stage of the year, as being dominated by the idea of disguise. Disguise suggests, again, covering. It's like whisperings. It's like acting out things, as if you cannot be open when you're an adult. You have to pretend to be something that you're not. Well, if we link it with our political interpretation, is this an image of a government being distrustful, a government being suspicious, a government that is worrying about conspiracies among the people, that feels that it needs to control the people? Well, maybe it is. And we have to ask ourselves the question, which of the two, the innocence poem or the experience poem, captures best what we think the world is really like? And as often with Blake, it's as if there's no answer to that. The answer perhaps is that we need the two of them together, the two contrary states of the human soul. It's through the placing of the two together, the juxtaposition of the two, the contrast between the two, that we arrive at what we might say is a more accurate vision of what life is really like. It's made up of these contrasting visions.